I didn't kill anyone. I just said a few things, and they did the rest. Charles Manson looked up and smiled. He didn't whisper those words in the dark. He said them in open court, under bright lights, surrounded by judges, jurors, reporters, and the young women who once volunteered to kill for him. He held no weapon, but he had something far more dangerous, an ideology. In August 1969, 5 people were murdered in a hilltop mansion on Cielo Drive. Among them was Sharon Tate, a rising Hollywood actress, 8.5 months pregnant. She had been stabbed so many times that the coroner had to number each wound to determine the sequence. A rope was looped around her neck and extended to the lifeless body of a man beside her, tying them together in a grotesque ritual. On the wall, scrawled in blood, was a single word: P.I.G. 2 days later, another couple was killed inside their home. The intruders took nothing. No signs of forced entry, no signs of robbery, just precise, repetitive stabbing, deliberate, almost ceremonial. On the living room wall, again written in blood, appeared a phrase, Helter Skelter, misspelled but intentionally so. The killers were barely adults, some just teenagers. They slaughtered with the ease of dancers in a performance. One sang while stabbing. Another recalled the moment like reading lines from a script. None expressed remorse. In fact, they believed they'd been chosen. The question soon shifted from who did this to what made them believe it was right. At the center stood a man who never touched a victim. He left no fingerprints, only a doctrine, written in blood. Charles Manson was born from a mistake. His mother, just 16 at the time, was a bootlegger, a brawler, a convict. She left him with relatives who barely acknowledged him. Manson grew up in juvenile halls, foster homes, and rooms where no one called him son. He learned to lie before he could spell. He stole at 8 and tried to assault another boy at 11. When beaten, he laughed. He became fluent in pain, and somewhere along the way, he understood. In a cold world, the one who causes pain survives the longest. In 1967, Manson was released from Terminal Island Federal Prison. He'd spent 17 years behind bars, almost his entire adult life. At 32, he had no job, no education, no family, no identity beyond a name America had long discarded. But there was one thing he hadn't lost: his gift for controlling people. California, at that moment, was soaked in music, drugs, and youth fleeing home in search of inner light. Into that kaleidoscope of hallucination walked Charles Manson, like a prophet from nowhere. He had no money, no status, only a battered guitar, tangled hair, and eyes like bottomless wells. But he spoke in a way that made people feel he knew something they didn't. He didn't preach, he told stories, he asked questions that turned inside out. He made young girls believe the world was ending, that Black Americans would rise and slaughter the whites, and only those who followed him, the family, would survive to rule the new order. Manson called it Helter Skelter. He took the name from a Beatles song, but in his mind, it was a revelation of apocalypse. He told his followers that when society burned, the family would retreat to the desert, into a sacred cave shown to him by God. There, he would rise as the Messiah. He didn't recruit with money. He recruited through psychological hunger. He found the abandoned, the abused, the forgotten. Girls molested by their stepfathers, boys discarded by their mothers, those who had never been loved properly. He gave them names, roles, a family. At Spahn Ranch, their hideout in the California hills, he ruled like a soft-spoken tyrant. Women cooked, sex was ritual, dissent was washed out. He passed out LSD, read the Bible, strummed his guitar, and preached about war and purification through blood. By nightfall, he whispered of a world flipped upside down, of white men falling and himself rising as their king. None of them had seen him kill, but one by one, they believed, if he gave the order, blood must follow. Charles Manson didn't need dreams. He was more awake than anyone. And because of that, he saw clearly what others refused to admit, that the American dream was already rotting from the inside. He didn't shatter it. He just pointed to the cracks, then gave them a push. Spahn Ranch wasn't a ranch the way cowboy movies made you believe. It was a patch of dust and weeds in the northwest edge of Los Angeles, once used as a backdrop for B-grade westerns, now left to rot with time. Dirt roads snaked through dry hills. Collapsing stables leaned into the wind. The wooden shacks stood silent, forgotten. But to Charles Manson, this was sacred ground. George Spahn, the nearly blind old man who owned the place, lived alone in the main house. In exchange for free lodging, the family took care of him. They fed the horses, cleaned up, cooked meals, and according to some accounts, certain young women provided him with special company each night. Manson didn't need money. He understood how to trade what was always in demand: youth, obedience, and the illusion of devotion. Spahn Ranch gave him exactly what he wanted: a place off the map where no one came, no one asked, and no one watched. By day, they lived like feral children. They rode horses shirtless, danced in the sun, smoked LSD-laced cigarettes, and believed they were returning to some pure, primal nature. Clocks didn't matter. Real names were discarded. They renamed each other: Sadie, Squeaky, Tex, Snake, as if shedding their pasts would give them new skin. They believed they were a tribe, and at the center stood the only man who claimed to know where the world was heading. By night, everything changed. When the light died, Manson's voice rose like smoke. He preached in riddles, weaving together the Bible, Beatles lyrics, and visions of apocalypse. Humanity, he said, was corrupt beyond saving. A race war was coming. Black Americans would rise and slaughter the whites, but would lack the intelligence to govern, so they would turn to him, Charles Manson, to lead. In that new world, he would reign as king. He took the drugs with them, but always a lighter dose. He danced nude, made love, sat in circles, but his eyes never glazed over. They watched, calculated. He knew who was wavering, who still questioned. And somehow he always pulled them back, melted their resistance, and reshaped them into whatever he needed. Manson didn't chain anyone. There were no locked doors. The ranch had no fences. Yet no one left. Some tried to run, but returned days later. "There's nothing out there waiting for me," one girl said. "Only here do I matter." At Spahn Ranch, she wasn't the girl her stepfather abused. She was Sadie Mae Glutz, right hand of the Messiah. A cult was forming, not with temples or scripture, but with broken people and one man who knew how to speak to their fractures. Manson never said the word kill, he said prepare. He didn't hand out knives. He planted the idea that to cross the threshold of revelation, blood had to be spilled first. Before Charles Manson became a monster, he wanted to be a musician. A drifter with a cheap guitar, wandering the beaches of Venice and the alleyways of Sunset Strip, playing songs and seducing lost souls with soft smiles and vague melodies. In his mind, music was salvation. Not religion, not politics, but songs that would make people kneel, listen, love him, and never leave. He once played for Dennis Wilson, drummer of the Beach Boys. For a brief time, Wilson was enthralled by the family, letting them stay at his home, introducing Manson to people in the music industry. For a few months, Manson believed the door was opening. He recorded demos. He waited. One of his songs was even reworked and released by the Beach Boys, with no credit to him. When it all collapsed, he didn't scream. He sat still. But in his eyes, something shifted. The death of his music dream wasn't just a disappointment, it was the final push. Charles Manson didn't want to be heard anymore. He wanted to be feared. He no longer sought applause. He wanted to leave behind something no one could erase, a message carved into history with a knife. He told the family that Helter Skelter had begun, that Black Americans were about to rise up, and their mission was to ignite the war. The fastest way? Kill white people, famous ones if possible, and leave bloody signs that would frame the black community. Then society would implode. Police would blame the wrong people. Whites would retaliate. A race war would begin. And amid the chaos, the family would retreat into the desert, where only they would survive. No one objected. No reasons were needed. For them, Manson didn't have to be right. He only had to speak, and it became gospel. At first it was minor rehearsals. He led the group into quiet suburbs at night, knocking on strangers' doors and running away, just to gauge reaction. He asked members to steal food, sneak into houses, scrawl nonsense onto car windows. But these were just drills. Because on one August night, under a full moon, with the ranch dead silent, he called Tex Watson close and said, softly, "It's time. Go out and make it bloody." No guitars played that night. No songs, no humming. Only footsteps leaving the ranch, climbing into a car. A group of young people, laughing like they were headed to a party. But in their bags were kitchen knives, a revolver, and a list of names already chosen. Music was dead, and blood was ready to speak. It was a quiet Friday night in Benedict Canyon. Cielo Drive wasn't a grand avenue. It was a narrow, winding road that snaked through silent hills, where mansions hid behind iron gates and thick hedges. The house at 10,050 Cielo Drive, once owned by a famous music producer, was being rented by actress Sharon Tate, who was 8.5 months pregnant. That night, 4 friends joined her for dinner. Jay Sebring, a renowned Hollywood hairdresser, Abigail Folger, heiress to the Folger coffee fortune, Abigail's boyfriend Wojtek Frykowski, a Polish screenwriter, and Stephen Parent, a young man who had just dropped by to visit the property's caretaker and was preparing to drive home. At the same time, a battered car crept slowly up the slope. Inside were 4 members of the family: Charles Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian. None wore gloves. None covered their faces. Linda was the only one instructed not to kill. Her role was to stay outside and act as lookout. Before they stepped out of the car, Tex looked at the group and said quietly, "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business." The first victim that night was Stephen Parent. As he pulled his car toward the front gate, Tex blocked the path and fired 4 shots through the window. No words, no hesitation. Stephen died instantly. Tex then cut the phone line. The group slipped in through a side window. Inside, the victims were still unaware. Tex burst into the living room, brandishing a revolver. The others followed, and within seconds everyone inside was tied up and gagged. Jay Sebring tried to shield Sharon and was struck, then shot point-blank in the chest. Wojtek Frykowski managed to loosen a hand and attempted to escape. He was stabbed repeatedly in the back and chest but kept crawling toward the front porch. He reached the steps, just enough to grip the door handle, before collapsing. Blood seeped between the tiles, marking the threshold between life and death. Abigail Folger fled toward the backyard. Patricia chased her down and stabbed her again and again. Abigail fell on the grass, trying to speak, but her throat was already full of blood. Sharon Tate was the last to remain alive. They kept her for last, like part of a ritual. Susan Atkins pulled her by the hair and stared directly into her eyes. Sharon pleaded, not for herself, but for her unborn child. "Please, don't kill my baby." Those were her final words. She was stabbed 16 times. No one knew which was the fatal wound. Afterward, Susan dipped her hand in Sharon's blood and smeared the word pig across the front door. A declaration, a twisted signature to mark their war on the world. Outside, Linda Kasabian stood by the car. She didn't see the violence directly, but she heard everything. The screams, the begging, the rupture of silence like something tearing loose from the earth. She didn't run. She didn't call the police. She stood still, watching the hill disappear beneath a veil of darkness. When the others returned to the car, no one spoke. Susan smiled faintly. Tex checked his revolver. Patricia wiped the blade against her coat. They drove off without a word. Back at Spahn Ranch, Charles Manson didn't ask if anyone had died. He only whispered, "Did you leave the signs, the way I told you?" The morning after the massacre at Cielo Drive, Charles Manson didn't ask who had died. He didn't need a list of victims or a recounting of the bloodshed. He sat in the main house at Spahn Ranch, eyes drifting through space, and asked in a quiet tone that sounded more like a prayer than a command, "Did you leave the signs, the way I told you?" No one questioned what he meant. That single sentence was enough to confirm that everything had gone according to plan. In the eyes of those around him, he didn't need to hold a knife to be in control. He was the man whose words turned into blood without ever touching a blade. Linda Kasabian hadn't participated in the killing, but she had heard everything, from outside the car, under the stars, with the screams cutting through the hillside. When the group returned, she saw something in their faces that hadn't been there before. Susan whispered that Sharon Tate had begged for her unborn child. Patricia chuckled softly while describing Abigail Folger trying to flee across the lawn. Linda remained silent, trembling with something unnamed. Manson noticed. That night he took her to the edge of the ranch. The wind carried the dry scent of dust and hay. He didn't threaten her, didn't raise his voice. He only said one thing. "You think there's a name you can go back to? A home? A past? There's nothing out there. Only this, only me." The next morning, Manson declared, "Last night was only the beginning, a message, but the world didn't hear. This time we'll speak louder." No one argued. Not a single voice hesitated. That evening, August 9th, Manson personally drove the car. With him were Tex Watson, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten. He chose a random house in the quiet neighborhood of Los Feliz, the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. None of them knew the couple. They weren't famous. They weren't involved in the film industry. They were just a middle-class American couple living quietly, doing nothing wrong. But to Manson, random was perfect. No motive, no pattern, only blood. Manson parked outside. He went in first. When Leno answered the door, Manson smiled and said he just wanted to talk. For a few minutes, he walked through the house like a guest. He noticed the paintings, the hallway, the kitchen light. Then he tied Leno's hands, laid him face down, and covered his head with a pillow. Rosemary was also tied up in the bedroom. Manson didn't strike them, didn't raise a knife. He simply arranged the scene. Then signaled for Tex and the women to come in. Tex moved to Leno first, stabbing him repeatedly in the neck and stomach. When he collapsed, Tex took a carving fork from the kitchen and drove it deep into the victim's abdomen. Then, with the point of a knife, he carved the word war into his flesh, letters deep and jagged. In the bedroom, Rosemary had begun screaming. She fought back, kicked, and struggled to break free. Patricia and Leslie pinned her down. According to Leslie's own later testimony, she stabbed Rosemary LaBianca 14 times, mostly after the woman had already passed out, or was possibly dead. Patricia added more stab wounds afterward. No one knows if Rosemary was still alive during those final moments. No one stopped to check. She died, never knowing why. Afterward, Tex instructed them to use the victim's blood to write on the walls. On the refrigerator, Helter Skelter, deliberately misspelled. On the living room wall, Death to Pigs, and scrawled in uneven lines, Rise. When they returned to the ranch, they entered as if returning from work. No one gasped. No one trembled. Susan asked, "Did you leave the writing?" Tex nodded. Manson stood in the kitchen, shaving. He didn't look himself in the eyes, just passed the blade over his skin, watching the foam fall away. In the mirror, dusty and cracked, he caught only fragments of his own face, just enough to know he was still there. No one asked what he was thinking. But just before he stepped out of the bathroom, he muttered, as if to no one, "They kill for me, even after I've left the room." 6 people were dead. 4 at Cielo Drive, 2 in Los Feliz. All had been brutally murdered. There were no signs of robbery. Nothing valuable was taken. Only knives, blood, and bizarre words left behind as if mocking the world. Pig, Helter Skelter, Death to Pigs, Rise. The LAPD opened 2 separate investigations. The Sharon Tate case, due to its celebrity connection, was placed at the forefront. The LaBianca murders were quieter, with less media noise. But in both cases, detectives faced the same wall. No clear motive. At first, they suspected drugs, particularly in the case of Wojtek Frykowski and Abigail Folger. But the deeper they dug, the less they found. The LaBiancas presented an even stranger puzzle. A conservative, middle-class couple with no enemies, no debts, no criminal ties. The crime scenes bore uncanny similarities, the same method of killing, the same blood-written messages, yet no one connected the two. Each team worked in isolation. One searched through the social circles of Roman Polanski. The other combed through the LaBiancas' finances. Everything led nowhere. And throughout it all, the name Charles Manson did not appear in a single report. Weeks later, in a small jail in Monterey County, Susan Atkins was arrested for an entirely different crime: the murder of musician Gary Hinman. While in custody, she shared a cell with 2 other female inmates. One night, for no reason beyond wanting attention, Susan began to talk. She boasted about her past, working as a topless dancer, discovering the truth, living with a man named Charlie who understood the world better than anyone. Then she said it plainly. "I'm the one who killed Sharon Tate. Me. Sadie." Her cellmate thought it was a sick joke, but Susan kept going. She recounted names, the house in Beverly Hills, the messages scrawled in blood, the screams. After a few days of this, the inmate reported it to jail staff. A written statement was taken. For the first time, from a completely unrelated location, the name Sadie Mae Glutz, Susan Atkins' alias, entered the official record of the Tate investigation. Detectives traced the name and confirmed that Sadie was Susan Atkins, formerly of Spahn Ranch. From there, they identified other members of the group: Tex, Patricia, Leslie. And finally, the man behind them all, Charles Manson, was officially mentioned in a police report for the first time. At first glance, his name meant little. Just another ex-convict with a string of petty charges, released in 1967. But as investigators began piecing things together, odd aliases, the ranch, the LSD, the stolen cars, the runaway youth, they realized they weren't dealing with a typical murder crew. They were staring into a belief system built around one man who knew exactly what he was doing. One veteran detective from the LaBianca investigation would later say, "We didn't uncover a killer. We stumbled into an entire world, its own language, its own rules, and one small god sitting at the center of it, convinced that blood was the only way to be heard. In December 1969, Charles Manson was officially indicted. Alongside him stood members of the family: Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten, and later Tex Watson. The list of charges stacked high: 7 counts of first-degree murder, 1 of conspiracy, and a string of lesser crimes related to robbery, assault, and kidnapping. But what made the public tremble wasn't the number of charges. It was the demeanor of the accused. They showed no remorse, no fear. They sang, they smiled, and throughout the entire trial, their eyes were always fixed on one person: the man who sat silently, never needing to speak, Charles Manson. From the moment he entered the courtroom, Manson didn't resemble any defendant in modern legal history. Dressed neatly in prison garb, his eyes darted constantly, almost never still. Whenever he glanced at the jury, it felt like hypnosis. At one point, he carved an X into his forehead with a razor blade and declared, "I have removed myself from your world." The next day, the 3 women followed suit, each carving the same mark into their skin, as if they were no longer individuals, but reflections of him. When asked to state his name, Manson replied, "I'm the one you made. I'm your product. I'm America's child." Whenever the prosecution presented evidence, crime scene photos, descriptions of stab wounds, survivor testimony, Manson remained still. He didn't argue. He let Susan sing in the courtroom. He let Patricia smile when discussing Sharon Tate. He knew, the stranger they acted, the more attention they'd get. He didn't need to be innocent. He needed to be immortal. Outside the courthouse, hundreds gathered each day. Journalists fought for spots. College students debated the philosophy of protest and violence as symbolism. The country split. One half demanded the death penalty. The other saw Manson as a symbol of society's failure. Some believed the family had been brainwashed, that Manson was merely insane. But as the confessions unfolded, how he selected the homes, issued orders, broke down their minds, it became clear that madness was more dangerous than malice. Susan Atkins spoke first, then Leslie Van Houten. Each testimony revealed another piece of the machine: Spahn Ranch, LSD cleansings, late-night sermons, and the chilling mantra: "If Charlie says kill, we kill." Every word reinforced one truth: Manson killed no one with his hands. He killed with belief. The judge once halted proceedings out of fear the jury was undergoing sustained psychological impact. On another day, Manson lunged from his seat, pointed at the prosecutor, and screamed, "You're a liar! I could kill you right now and be forgiven!" Security rushed to subdue him, but his eyes never showed panic. He stared into the cameras, like a man directing the very trial he was inside. After nearly 10 months, Manson and his co-defendants were sentenced to death. But in 1972, California abolished the death penalty, and their sentences were commuted to life in prison. None of them appeared disappointed. When asked for comment, Susan Atkins said, "Charlie's still alive. That means we still have something to live for." The trial ended. But the name Charles Manson never disappeared, not as a criminal, but as a parasite embedded in America's memory. He wasn't forgotten. He became a symbol, twisted, toxic, but real, for what modern society refuses to confront. That belief, when corrupted, can kill more easily than any knife. Charles Manson never confessed. For nearly 50 years after the trial, he lived inside California's prison system like a shadow celebrity, receiving letters from around the world, mentioned constantly in the press, printed on the T-shirts of rebellious youth. He gave interviews like he was part of a late-night show. He smiled when people spoke of the dead. At times, he denied orchestrating the murders. At others, he bragged about mind control. And through all those decades behind bars, he never once apologized. Sharon Tate never got to raise her child. She died before turning 30, murdered as a symbol torn apart in a culture spinning off its axis. Her parents, Paul and Doris Tate, went from being a quiet, grieving family to becoming activists, traveling from parole hearing to parole hearing for decades to ensure the people who killed their daughter never walked free again. Not out of vengeance, but because they knew, when justice sleeps, evil remembers the way home. Leno and Rosemary LaBianca were not famous. They had no publicists, no Hollywood connections. But they never should have become victims of something so meaningless. They died not for what they had done, but simply because their lives weren't loud enough to deter the madness of Charles Manson. Their deaths weren't caught on camera. There were no global headlines when they were buried. But the stab wounds on their bodies remain preserved in coroner reports, and in the memory of detectives who never forgot what they saw. And those who lived? Susan Atkins died in prison of brain cancer after nearly 40 years behind bars. Patricia and Leslie both applied for parole multiple times and were denied each time. No one forgot that they stabbed people who were begging for their lives. No one accepted a world where saying, "I've changed," could wash away blood. Manson died in 2017 at the age of 83. The X on his forehead, later reshaped into a crooked cross, still marked his skin, as if to mock God one final time. Before he died, he insisted he had done nothing wrong. He died like a man who didn't need an exit, because hell had always lived inside him. The Manson case closed in court, but it never closed in America's psyche. It split a generation. It exposed the rot beneath the flowers of a movement that promised peace and love. And it revealed something much harder to accept. Some people are so lost, so hungry to belong, that they are willing to kill just to believe they matter. Evil doesn't always come with gunfire. Sometimes it comes with a whisper, a glance, a promise gone sideways. And when a society forgets its weakest, its silent ones, its children unloved, there will always be another Charles Manson, waiting. And there will always be others like Sharon, like Leno, like Rosemary, paying the price for living too peacefully in a world that no longer hears the voice of reason.